welcome to another episode of the Farm Chatter podcast. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode of the podcast is sponsored Le'ila Nishmas Sima Zisel Etel Bas Rav Shaul Yecheskel Alei Shalom. This episode of the podcast is also sponsored by KosherCloth.com. One thing I appreciate about KosherCloth.com is how easy they make buying stam, whether you're looking for tefillin, mezuzahs, a megillah, or even a sefer Torah. They take the time to explain the options, answer your questions, and help you find what's right for your needs and budget. To learn more, visit KosherCloth.com, KosherKlaf.com, or call or WhatsApp 516-737-5436. They have pickup options in New York and New Jersey, as well as fast shipping across the country. You can find a link and more information in the show notes below. To sponsor an episode of the podcast or to support the podcast, please email me sfarmchatter@gmail.com or check out a link and information in the show notes. You can also find a link in the show notes to subscribe to the Farm Chatter WhatsApp community, where I post new books, new Sfarim, book deals, and more, as well as a link to subscribe to the Farm Chatter WhatsApp status if you prefer to get things that way. And finally, if you can please subscribe to the podcast wherever it is that you listen, rate and review the podcast. With that, enjoy this episode. Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of this Farm Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Rav Michah Markowitz and Rav Shaul Goldman, who are the editors, and they are publishing the new siddur, or series of siddurim rather, rpd.siddur, which is, as we'll talk about, the minhag Sfard, and it's just Alpi minhag Arizal with the Prime Vital. We'll get into that based on the siddur rpd, and so on and so forth. So thank you both for joining me.
I'm able to be here.
Happy to be here.
Okay, I also should mention that this episode, when it'll air, Mirza Shem, we're recording this before, but it's going to air, which is Hey Av, which is Sunday this year, which is the Arizal's yard side. So that's kind of, Rav Michah has been bothering me for a while, saying, oh, we should do this episode, we should talk about this as an important topic. And, you know, gradually as we kind of discussed this, it came closer to the art side. I said, oh, okay, you know what? This is actually a good idea. I actually did a recent series with Rabbi Walter on TeFillah with him, and there's an interest, and I've been getting comments. And this is something that we also did a series in early print on the podcast. So these are things that's always relevant. It kind of comes up, but it's not something we specifically focused on. With the Arizal's yard side, I figured it's a good idea. So let's start off with whichever one of you wants to start first, but let's start off. Tell the listeners about yourselves and your background.
Sure, I guess I'll start here. So I grew up in a conservative home. Wouldn't say it wasn't religious, but it wasn't exactly where we, where somebody learning Kol is normally situated. So I grew up in I grew up in Cincinnati and in Raleigh, North Carolina, and in St. Louis. I ended up going to the University of Rochester, where I grew into my Judaism over there. The various different types of people. I was involved with Chabad a little bit, and I was involved with the Hillel house over there. I went on Birthright. It was an HaTefillah for 6 months, for 6 weeks rather. The rabbi of the HaTefillah in St. Louis actually was close with my father when they were kids in El Paso, Texas. I was at the Shiva Chofetz Chaim in Rochester. Was incredibly warm, helped me be part of their community, the shul over there. It was a very, very wonderful experience while I was there. So Baruch Hashem, I was able to, after that, I was able to go to Arizal to learn. But in the meantime, during I was in university, actually my parents were nifter. And so I became close to this time with the Levitansky family, Sora Levitansky, who you actually had Nachi as from his podcast, and his wonderful family. They just brought me in to the whole mishpach over there. So I'm still part. They're considered, they're my mishpacha these days. So as I went to Sameach, I joined the regular shiurim. I became close with Rabbi Yoni Peretz. It was a halacha shiurim. I have to go here and learn some halacha. So the person that I felt was the one that spoke to me the most was Rabbi Peretz. He was actually giving Sephardi halacha. And me, an Ashkenazi Jew, I'm going to the ears. He's really giving everything. Because the Sephardi these days really needs to know Ashkenazi halacha as well. So I learned from him both as just halacha, just also as a Rabbi in the Talmud of Rav Abba Berman. I learned how to appreciate halacha and lumdus not as steer to each other. So I became a little bit more proficient in halacha from just being around him. During this time, I got married. But before that, how did I meet my wife? My shadchan was a person by the name of Hillel Schreiner. And lived in Sanhedrin at the time. He lives in Givat Zev with me now over here. But we had what we called a Erev Shabbos Vaj V'Shmiras Haguf. We did a little bit of we had some exercise on Erev Shabbos, and we got to know each other. And through him, I got to know his wife is Shaul's cousin, and so I got to know Shaul from some Shabbos students that we had together. And then I got to go to him for Shabbos for Shabbos. He was married and living in Maldafna with a couple of kids. And that's how I met. That's how I met with Shaul. I think it's very important to appreciate that just that background, to know where it's coming from. The background of any historical podcast is always so important. So I got married. I lived in Maldafna. I was close to Shaul. We actually had a chavrusa shop for one zman, in the Darim for one zman. So he had moved back to America. And I moved on. I was learning by Rabbi Jermaine's Koil for a little bit, and then in Kesher. And so again, I got access to a brisk over there. I ended up, Baruch Hashem, afterwards, went to the Mir, learned Meril's Chabura, where I continued my experience learning Sugyas l'Halacha. So learning Sugyas l'Halacha was really where I started over there, to really appreciate how Psak worked. Appreciate that there is such a thing as how to get to there. So it's regular stuff. Mishnah Berurah from Sugis, Beis Yosef, Shulchan Aruch, Mishnah Berurah. So in the meantime, I became a loan broker as well in the afternoons. So I was able to keep learning in the morning. And shout out to the alternative loan industry. People are going to ask, "Oh, you do MCAs? You do MCAs, right? The MCAs, right? Everybody in Lakewood's doing MCAs. MCAs. Shout out to the MCA community. I'm connected to them. I don't necessarily focus on them, but people can still come to me for business loans, and it's definitely a part of where the Kesef Minayin is from that alternative loan community, which is quite big. So shout out to them, and if people do listen to this podcast and are interested in what we have to say, then I do think a little bit outside the box, as we'll find out, because in my 8th grade, I was voted as the most outspoken. So that's what we're holding right now. I'll because of that community, because of that alternative loan industry, I ended up having a convention in Miami about 2023 at this point, the beginning, and I'm like, okay, I want to go to Miami for this. What am I going to do for Shabbos? I said, I need to go to Baltimore. I have a lot of family, I have a Tansy family in Baltimore, and I wanted to visit Rabbi Shaul, who I haven't seen in quite some time. So we'll pick up the story after that, but I will turn it over to Rabbi Shaul to explain his little background over there.
So first of all, I'm very honored to be Michah's friend. So I just want to put that out there first. And the fact that we're both partners in this is something that I do not take for granted. Including his friendship and his loyalty and his understanding and knowing how to be a good friend and knowing how to be a good project manager. And so I just want to put that out there first. My journey, I guess, starts in Utica. My father thought he would have been able to launch a school. It didn't work out like that. So at a certain point, we needed to go somewhere that had a school. So my father found a position in CHAT, Community Hebrew Academy of Toronto. They offered him what looked like an amazing salary, even in Canadian, even adjusting for Canadian dollars to American dollars. Unfortunately, they did not realize that the cost of living was so high that it was pretty much prohibitive for us to stay. So when my father found another stella that was available, we left Toronto and we went, and my father found it in this job that was formed in Cincinnati, which was to be both daily, weekly, and seasonally the assistant rabbi or assistant reverend in the German Jewish community that was almost the original minyan called New Hope, based Knesset Tikva Chadasha, in which it was very, very, very strictly traditional German rites, Redelheim, all the good stuff. And my father was both the assistant rabbi there, as well as he was the Kashrus administrator. He was the rabbinic administrator of the Vad Ha'ir of Cincinnati, which means that his role in Cincinnati was like that of, let's say, Rabbi Fishbane in CRC, or that of Rav Heinemann in the Star K, in as much as that they are all the kashrus administrators. Even some of them are also the Rav and the Paisik of their respective organization. My father had a Paisik above him, a very chashuv Lubavitcher chassid by the name of Rav Zelig Sharfstein, and which is actually an interesting turn of relationship, because he studied in RJJ, where a great uncle of mine by the name of Rav Lazer Ladiger, who was a very, very, very charismatic and very successful teacher in RJJ, and he was a Galiciano Maskil, and in the best way possible. But he has a lot of, a bunch of different published works. Very interesting person. Unfortunately, he did not leave any children behind. And anyway, so getting back to my father's background. So my father's background with that, my father's father actually studied in yeshivas in Europe, and my father's mother's family also came from a very, very stark in terms of their Torah mitzvahs and Shmir's Torah mitzvahs. They were very stark, which was unusual in those times to still be stark. I mean that in the literal sense, to be really strong about it and to be unabashed about it and to be unapologetic about it. And Baruch Hashem, they both managed to be able to get to the United States and to bring their families over to the United States before the Second World War closed everything down. And on my mother's side, I come from a family of Lithuanian and Russian Rabbanim and Talmidei Chachamim. And so went through Cincinnati Hebrew Day School, went through Michah in Ner Yisrael, tried to find my way after Michah, meaning high school. So I bounced around different places that would have me. And I was in the yeshiva called Linden, New Jersey, which called Zichron Lemo, which is now located in Union, New Jersey. I was in a yeshiva that was formerly called Derech HaTalmud, now defunct, known as Rav Ilson's yeshiva. I was first man by Rabbi Yaakov Friedman, the one who's I think currently in Beitar, I believe. And I also spent time afterwards when I was some time in the Mir with Rabbi Falshman Levitz. And after that, also, I spent some time by Rabbi Simcha Maimon in his Kailol. That's run also by Rabbi Yanti Burstein. And how did I get to this? Because my father came from Chassidish stock. And I was always very curious about what exactly that meant and what exactly it meant that, like, Chassidim or people who are Chassidic adjacent or Chassidish light or Chassidish sympathetic, what does it mean that they daven Nusach smart? And is that the same thing as Nusach Hari? Is it not the same thing as Nusach Hari? And of course, everybody was telling me that their Nusach is Nusach Hari. So the Lubavitchers told me their Nusach is Nusach Hari. And the Sfardim told me that their Nusach is Nusach Hari. And then, so at a certain point, the truth is that I had a very, very interesting conversation with Yid, a very, very special, very unusual Yid. He passed away without any children. And his name is also, by the way, Simcha. And we had a wonderful conversation about Nusach HaTefillah and the history of Chassidus. In fact, somewhere in my Sfarim, which are still being stored in Eretz Yisrael, Mitzvah Shem, I'll be able to open them up and use them in a good way. Yes, I still have that. I still have those papers that he wrote down, a whole bunch of different notes on the history of Chassidus and the history of the Arizal, and the history of Nusach Arizal, and the history of Siddur Arizal. And the truth is, he really fired up both my enthusiasm for the subject of Nusach HaTefillah in general, and also the unique nuances between different types of Chassidish Nuschos. And then eventually, which is, I think, the watershed moment, is a particular siddur that came on the market, and that really not only turned me, but turned lots of other people around the world into, big believers and big, very, 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 very emotionally and intellectually and spiritually invested in this kind of siddur to be put out outside HaYoser Tov. And this is not Chalila to compete with any other siddurim. This is a very specific kind of siddur for a very specific kind of person, whether they're interested in the scholarship or whether they're interested in the Nusach or they're just interested in what we did, which is very, very nice that somebody would actually spend time just to see what we did, Baruch Hashem. And so that's I guess that's where I am right now. And now currently I'm based in Baltimore, and we've been working not only on the siddur, but I'm also a professional chavrusa, and I give a few shiurim lach here and there. And Baruch Hashem, I try to keep busy.
So I'll just throw it over here a little more. So while I was in Miami, so Shaul was recovering, Baruch Hashem, he's after cancer, but it's important that I was able to go visit him in Baltimore for Shabbos. I was by Shabbos by Levitansi cousin Mishpacha. I was going to visit, do some Bikur Cholim, and while we were there, we struck up a conversation about this concept of the siddur. Why? Because when I was in college, I was listening to shiurim heavily from Rav Tatz. When I got there to Israel, all my Rebbeim were all Talmidim of Rav Moshe Shapiro. I learned some for certain goes by Rav Moshe Shapiro. So just to get the idea of a deeper understanding of what you're doing was something very, very important to me. So when I started actually learning Kabbalah, which was about a few years ago, picking that up, I realized there's something wrong here. This is Ashkenaz. You say this word, you don't say that word. And this kavana has this, when you say this word, has this kavana, but you don't say that word. So I come to Shaul and I ask him, what do we do? And he says, pick up the siddur rpd. Daled. So I'm like, what is that? So that's where this really started. That was about 2 years ago. And now how would you like to start? How would you like to start? We're going to the next stage.
Okay, so now let's turn to the topic of the episode, which is the Siddur rpd Daled, which I read. Okay, so now I'm sure listeners who know rpd Daled is 1524. So wait, Arizal's born. How does this work out with Arizal? So why are we talking about rpd Daled 1524, but then we're talking about the Arizal? Arizal is later. So if you could let's kind of clarify a couple of things before we can dive into. Obviously, we'll talk about your siddur later on, but we want to talk about the siddur, in general, and Nusach and so on and so forth.
Right. So I'll start just quickly over here. Let's just read the words of Rav Chaim Vital. It's very important to read the words because a lot of this podcast will be dependent on Rav Chaim Vital himself. V'zeh Nusach HaTefillah kasher kibaltem Arizal v'kidei shelo arich echtov siduro kafi tefus hasiddur hagadol shel kol hashana miminig Sfarad hanitfas t'shanas rpd Daled Yitzira. Now, anybody that opens up a rpd Daled is 1524. Anybody who knows anything about learning anything Rav Chaim Vital writes, or what they think Rav Chaim Vital wrote, we'll get to that soon also, knows this line exists somewhere. The question is, how seriously do they take it? So let's just talk about rpd Daled. Let's talk about the quick background over here and try to riff through it as fast as we can. Just because I know you and Nachi have a podcast coming out about the history of Kisvei Ari coming up, and you had the 7-part series on history of the Zohar, which is incredibly important to understand the background over here. So we'll leave that aside. We'll try to get just enough background to understand this. 1524 rpd Daled, Arizal is born. Was when this is referring to. Sorry. 1519 was actually the first edition, and in 1544, Daled Shin was a third edition. This is actually building on another siddur, which we'll get to much later, about the siddurim that were published in the Iberian Peninsula before the Gerus Sfarad. But let's talk about the Arizal back over here. He's born in 1534, and he in Arizal, he moved to Mitzrayim, and his father was nifter when his father was very old, and the Arizal was about 3 years old. His father was an Ashkenazi, very important, right? It's Ari actually they think it's a Donenu Rabbeinu Yitzchak. It's actually Ashkenazi Rabbeinu Yitzchak, Luria. That's the Aleph. So he moves to Mitzrayim. From Mitzrayim, he spends his days and nights in his life with his mother's family, who are Sfaradim, who's over there in Egypt. So he grows amongst that community. Then as he gets older, he gets married. He learns. Elio Novi comes comes his father and tells him about how much he was. He comes and has a chavrusa shop with him in Mitzrayim. He tells him eventually, you have to go to Eretz Yisrael. There's certain things I can only megala to you over when you're there. So he goes to Yisrael, and there about 6 months later he meets with Chaim Vital, and he's told at different points that the person you need to be learning with is Chaim Vital. You came into the world to give over to him, and Chaim Vital's tafkid is to then give it over to the world. And as anybody who really knows anything, and if you open up the words that Arizal writes are much more terse than Rav Chaim Vital's actual how he brings it out, how he teaches it, how he writes it, and how he flows, and how he describes and builds things up. Then you have so the Arizal's nifter on Hey of Shin Lamed base. It's 1572. Some people call it Shin Lamed Gimel because it's like the end of the year. So then at that point we have the next 47 years of Rabbi Chaim Vital's life. He has access to what he learned by his Rabbi. Now let's get it very clear over here. Rabbi Chaim Vital is not just some kosev over there. He got smicha from the Alshech, and the Alshech got smicha from the Beis Yosef. The Beis Yosef got smicha from Rabbi Rav, who was. When we're talking about smicha, we're talking about real smicha. Smicha, but pasking on kol Torah kula, tyrus, mumim, everything. And this is when he was young, and I think it's worthwhile. We'll talk about Chaim Vital a little more, but we have to talk about it very specifically. The Maggid told the Beis Yosef. I believe it's quoted in your when you talked about the Maggid in your podcast. Also, Maggid told the Beis Yosef that to be shomer, to tell the Alshech to be shomer on Rav Chaim Vital, is half the schus of the world is made on his father's tefillin before us, and the other half is totally on him. So from there we have a very big. We called it, and we're going to talk about this a lot. The Rav Chaim Vital was the term we use is controlling witness on what the Arizal had to give over the world. So we have Rav Chaim Vital. We have his son, Rav Shmuel Vital, was born. Rav Chaim Vital, so he moves to Yerushalayim briefly. Then he goes to Damascus. The whole story in the Chidah we won't go into. From there, he's the Rav in Damascus. Whether he's buried there or not today, discussion. There's a whole article about it. Could be he's buried today in Kiryat Malachi, but his son Shmuel Vital was when the Arizal's nifter. He collected all the documents, all the papers from everybody, and everybody said, Chaim Vital, he's the Talmud, he gets everything. So he goes to Damascus eventually with all the stuff, and he's basically writing the next 45 years of his life, writing everything down. So a lot of this stuff is actually, believe it or not, on the Hebrew Wikipedia page about the Kisvei Ari. So if one wants to chaz this, is very helpful. What happens is he writes notes and additions. Those notes and additions are actually stolen when he was sick. Those are published b'chaim, but not by him, but published by Triniki, and known as the Tarnei Yaros. From there, and then he writes his other main work, which he really called Eitz Chaim. That Eitz Chaim was stored by him for his whole life, and he never published it. Shmuel Vital had it, and Shmuel Vital's son was born when his father was about 50 years old. So when Shmuel Vital was about 22, that's when his father was nifter, and he says, Ad Mosai Yiyes Sifrei Abba Mori Zal Ganozim Tachas Yodi. They're by me. Vani Ubesi Navod Es Hashem Ve'ein Lezulasi Chelik Behem Lios Ki Kol Akar Behem Yelah Liosam Ruben Kekulam Mefuzarim Mefuradim Kinisinosam Mesinai Ve'ein Mukdam Memorchem B'Torah. He says it's all out of order. I have to reorder it and put it out. So while this is all happening in the background, okay, this is the late 1600s. We're talking about the mid to late 1600s. Shabtai Tzvi's in the background. Spinoza's in the background. So all this is happening at the same time, and Kabbalah is becoming more popular, and people are learning it. But at the same time, it's becoming kind of dangerous. So because of and people are not okay with it because once Shabtai Tzvi comes around. So I'll let Shaul take over here because there's a lot of details over here about what happened to Kisvei afterwards to be just do a bekitzer, try to be a bekitzer about it.
All right. Well, thank you very much for Michah. I'm going to actually use this time to accomplish two different items that are on our agenda, and that is number one, to trace the Kisvei Ari, but also to describe through that a canon that we, meaning myself, Michah, myself, have devised for ourselves to use as a matrix of filtration through which to view the Kisvei Ari. And I'll explain what I mean, but with a little bit of history and a little bit of bibliography, but hopefully it's going to be interesting. And that is as follows. So again, we'll start where Michah ended off, which is that there's this document. This document is called the Eitz Chaim. This document is something that Reb Chaim Vital is writing and rewriting and organizing and reorganizing, and till his very, very end, he was editing and changing words and really, really trying to get it as perfect as possible. And that is the Eitz Chaim. There's a few other Sfarim that Reb Chaim Vital is also wrote. Most famously are the Sefer Shari Kedusha, as well as, which is a Sefer of Musar, technically, of how to become worthy of learning Kabbalah and also becoming a Baal Ruach HaKodesh and a Baal Nevuah. And then there's this very, very large and almost beautifully meandering work because of the fact that it's meant to be a warehouse of drashos of Reb Chaim Vital, and that is known as the Eitz Hadas Tov, of which there are now multiple volumes published by different publishing houses, and many other Sfarim, among whom we will also give special mention to the Sefer Chuvas Be'er Mayim Chaim of Reb Shmuel Vital, where he brings Chuvas of Reb Chaim Vital. There's also Tyrus from Reb Chaim Vital that are brought in the Chuva in the collection known as Chaim Shnaim Yeshalim. It's a beautiful collection. And that's in terms of the Chiburim of Reb Chaim Vital himself. Now, what's interesting is that the what was published and what was available to the masses is not the exact same ordinally as the writing of these different chiburim. So right now we're going to just look at the organization of who had which chiburim at which time and who's working with what, and the different, well, I like to call the different chativot, the different like blocks of either oirchim with an ayin or time people involved, because they're usually similar. They're usually referring to the same matrix of ksavim, and they usually have the same kind of approach to the aricha. So first, to get everything out of the way, there's this entire genre based on the Torah of the Arizal. Even though there were these kinds of things at the time of Ramak, but it really blew up under the Arizal because the entire Torah and application of Kavanas really blew up under the Arizal. I could add that the interesting thing is that if you look in a Siddur Ramak, Tefillah Moshe Ramak, what is that? Ironically, it has a little bit of Ramak, and it's mostly Ramaf, meaning the Torah of Rameir Poppers, the Baal Priyatz Chaim, interestingly enough. And who used it famously? So again, it's brought by the Baal Or HaYashar, which became the Siddur of Kaidanov and a few other different similar Chatzeris. Okay, and they're basically on that Siddur Ari, which is really technically a Siddur Ramak. Okay, we'll get to the Shalom later. The Kitzer, we have the Chiburim of Reb Chaim Vital. Let's assume right now that the Eitz Chaim that Reb Chaim Vital has is pure, pristine, Madura Basra Basra. However, the first exposure of Torah Ari to the world came through two things. Number one, there were this genre called Sefer Kavanas, which basically took a kitzer, so to speak. If you were to take a kitzer snapshot and condense and pick the simplest, easiest, most accessible pieces throughout whatever you want to call it, Shar HaTefillah, Shar HaKavanas, etc., and then put it into a sefer, which is very, very, very terse and has maybe like a little bit on everything, and then maybe a lot on one or two things, because different Talmidim of the Arizal or different Talmidim of the Arizal specialize in different kinds of kavanas. So, for instance, the Tikkunei Shabbos are mostly built on the Tyrus of either Talmidei Ramak, which is his own thing, or specifically the Tyrus of Reb Avram Halevi Bruchim. In fact, many of the non-Reb Chaim Vital Hanhogas that are associated with the Arizal are really found in what the Arizal told Reb Avram Halevi, Reb Avram ben Eliezer Halevi Bruchim, in the many, many different chiburim known as Tikkunei Shabbos, which are originally published at the end of the Reish HaKatzar, famously in Lublin and other places. Anyway, not Lublin, in Venezia and Amsterdam. Anyway, B'kitzur, so we have the Torah of now Rav Shmuel Vital. Rav Shmuel Vital was an Adam Gadol B'Ma'id, as we mentioned. He was a Meira Halacha and a Meishiv Chuvas, and he was a Rosh Hashiva. And famously, he was the one who had bias over the Ksav Yad. Rav Shmuel Vital did a number of things. Number one is he made Hagoyas on his father's works, either correcting something that very often had to do with a language issue or a cheshbon issue, whether it had to do with how many letters or how many words or what is the gematria. And very often he'll bring a very, very important sushtel, a very, very, very important cross-reference to other Kisvei Arizal. So that's most of the Hagoyas, what we call the Hagoyas Ash, the Hagoyas Omar Shmuel, that you have throughout the Sefer, whether you want to call Shar, whether you want to call Priest Chaim or Shar HaTefillah or Shar HaKavanos. Now, Rav Shmuel Vital himself, besides writing what we know as Shar HaKavanos, which is his taking of his father's Eitz Chaim, what we call the Shar HaTefillah of Eitz Chaim, and he took all the shmuas that are from Mizulasi, the Hainu, that Reb Chaim Vital heard not directly from the Arizal, but from other Talmud of the Arizal. Most of them, not all of them, but most of them are Kavanas and Tyrus that are only meant for them. And Reb Chaim Vital, if he heard it and he felt it was Oisgehalten, so he would keep it in there, even though he kept it segregated. And Reb Shmuel Vital felt, if my father, Reb Chaim Vital, held it's Oisgehalten, so then it's obviously Gesund, and it's obviously Oisgebayet, and it's obviously Oisgearbetet. So my father did not want to take it, don't want to take, credit for something that's not his. Okay, good, Beseder. But for us, it's much better and easier to now put everything back to where it's supposed to be. So what does Shmuel Vital do? That's what he does. He rewrites, so to speak, his father's chibur into something in which there is no halukah between Mizulasai and not Mizulasai, even if it may have been marked originally. Eventually, that halukah is gone. And then by the time that the Shar Kavanos is published, eventually in Salonika in 1852, again, Shmuel Vital was nifter in 1677. So we're talking way, way after the Shmuel Vital's Petira. And that's when it's published. That's when it shows up in Thessaloniki, which is its own story. But the point is like this. So Shmuel Vital is one of the Talmidim Muvhakim of his father, and he's also one of his father's biggest Chassidim. Why is that important? Because if he says that there's a toes over here in the cheshbon of gematria, or he says that even if my father wrote it like this, there's obviously a mistake, and I just want to be clear that I want to be ne'eman and loyal to what my father actually wrote, but I think that what he wrote over here is a mistake, and he will do that from time to time, and very often when he does that, it's a very obvious fix, and it's the covet of his heilige father. Now, Shmuel Vital himself, however, in writing his Chibur Chemdas Yisrael, did two things in one. He both re-edited and reorganized Tyrus HaArizal into something that's actually technically usable as a siddur, but also made the Tyrus, which he officially discussed in theory in his version known as Shar Kavanos, he now makes it Halacha L'Maisadik in a siddur format that actually has nuschos of the tefillas of Chol, Shabbos, Chodesh, etc. and that is the Arichos of Rav Shmuel Vital. Now, at the same time as Rav Shmuel Vital, older than Rav Shmuel Vital, but also someone who considers himself a Talmud of both Rav Chaim Vital and Rav Shmuel Vital, is the Heilige Rabbi Yaakov ben Chaim Semach. Also, you're going to see so much of this has to do with the Chachmei, with the Yidden who lived in Syria, the Chachmei Aram Soba, whether they're from Chaleb or whether they're from Damascus. Rabbi Yaakov ben Chaim Semach was a Talmud and neighbor of Rabbi Chaim Vital and Rav Shmuel Vital. Rabbi Yaakov ben Chaim Semach was, even though he was older than Rav Shmuel Vital, he considered himself a Talmud of Rav Shmuel Vital. There's this entire chib or a little contrasol of Rabbi Yaakov Semach of specifically mudim that he got from observing and learning from Rav Shmuel Vital, Befrat Shebefrat, that he had his own kutras of hanhagas that he took from his Heilige Rebbe. So now to complete the trifecta, we have to mention a non-Chalabite, another Damascene, which is, as we mentioned, Reb Chaim ben Avram, who's known very often as Reb Chaim ben Aram Soba, who's the author of the Sfarim. Sometimes they're known as Tur Barekas, sometimes they're known as the Makar Chaim, but basically, it's he, as well as Shmuel Vital, in the body of the main work, which is what we call Chaim Shnai Mishalem. He as well Chaim Shmuel Vital. There already were major chiburim in halacha that had become mainstream, and they have become classics that are now the text that's learned by everyone. And of course, among those two are none other than Tur with Beis Yosef, Shulchan Aruch with Ramah, and Levush. To the point that now Reb Shmuel Vital is writing Shtekach Torah to Rabbi Yashiv Levushin. And not only that, but Reb Shmuel Vital on top of Shulchan Aruch, and Rabbi Yaakov Semach in many chiburim of his on top of Shulchan Aruch, as well as almost all of the Mekubalim down, are all dealing with the minhag and halacha of the Beis Yosef, very often specifically not like what Rav Chaim Vital indicated or Rav Chaim Vital said, but we see it's clear that the Beis Yosef clearly was kavish to the point where all other Mekubalim who present something as keneged the Beis Yosef, unless it's something that's very, very famously for the Ari, famously attributable to the Ari and famously accepted, then some of these minhagim just did not get any airtime, so to speak, except for in a very, very few kind of exceptions. Anyway, so the point is like this. We have these three Heilige Talmidei Rabbi Chaim Vital. We have Rabbi Chaim Avram HaKohen of Damascus, of Chalab, of Aram Soba. You have Rabbi Yaakov ben Chaim Semach. You have Rabbi Shmuel Vital. These three are all Talmidim of Rabbi Chaim Vital. They are the most Neman. Their Tyrus are the most similar to each other. Then you have the beginning of a completely new idea, which is the Aricha of Rameir Poppers. Rameir Poppers took the idea and Chiburim of Rabbi Shmuel Vital himself and said, why don't I do what Rabbi Shmuel Vital did, but one better? Dahainu, I'm going to take all the Torah of his father, whether his father got it from Zulasai, or whether his father got it directly from Pekachre of the Ari, and I'll also take all the Chiburim that I know of from the other Talmidim who are not of Rav Chaim Vital, but it's Iskahalted according to what I'm saying, like the Zulasai that Rav Chaim Vital is bringing anyway. So if it's going to im kvar, oz kvar, so therefore Mayor Palmer's built and organized a beautiful, organized tapestry of shmuas from Reb Chaim Vital directly from the Ari in different phases, and most of the time labeled, and it actually became the chibur, or the set of chiburim. His Pri Chaim, his so-called Derech Chaim, which is the Eitz Chaim, where all the Iker Teres are Ari about Simsum and about Meichen and about Zivugin, and all the major tyrants of the Arizal are in what we call Eitz Chaim, which is what the Rameir of Pluppers calls Derech Eitz Chaim, and of course the Sefer Neif Eitz Chaim, which has the other different elements of the other Sha'arim, which have different parshanios of the Arizal on Zoyar, Chazal, Psukim, etc. And from Rameir Pluppers down, we have an entire chima that's basically based all on Rameir. And that includes two major Mekubalim, plus 1.5, and we'll see. and that is Rav Nosson Shapira, also known as the Nasi, okay, also known as Rav Nosson Rav Reuven David Tevel Shapira, and he is the Baal Machberes HaKedesh, and as well, he also wrote his own Sefer Kavanas with his own Hagayas called the Sefer Kavanas Ma'oros Nosson. Now, he was definitely one of the major orchim and one of the makablim of Torah Arizal, mainly through Ramaf. And it is very, very much based on Ramaf and Ranash, or the Nasi, whoever you want to call him, that the next Makubal in our canon, Ramaz, Ramaz Zakuta, who, again, we're not referring to who his Rebbeim were. We're talking about what ksavim he's dealing with and what he is doing with said ksavim. Comes the Ramaz, takes everything that we just saw from Ramaf, from Meir Poppers, and from Ranash, and then he also runs it through other different Chiburim that he had access to, puts it all together, and he now has Hagayas on Sefer Kavanas. He also had his own siddur with Kavanas and Nusach that he had. Okay, so he's trying to make a cholent of everything, including what Rav Nosson Shapira has to add or correct, etc. And then finally, after Ramaz, we have to mention the great Rabbi Emmanuel Chayriki, the Baal Mishas Chassidim, who, of course, inspired many a Chosheva Siddur of the Chassidim, as well as the Sfardim. Another major couple works we have to mention, because we just have to mention it, and that is the Chibur Chemdas Yomim, absolutely Yesodistic Sefer for Nusach and for Minhag, according to the Kabbalim. And as well, we also have to mention the Heilige Sefer of the Heilige Sfarim, rather, of Shalmei Chagiga, Shalmei Tzibur, of Rabbi Yaakov Yisrael, of Yisrael Yaakov, Al-Ghazi, the father of Arizal Al-Ghazi, and he was a major Paisik. And it's very interesting how, in some ways, he's kind of like the same generation of Chida, but kind of not. And the truth is, however, that he is kind of serving a little bit as an Eirich, without exactly trying to be. And once you get to him, now you're in the dar of whom? In the dar of Rashash and Chida. And of course, Rashash, in his way, and Chida, in his way, they conquer the world. They conquer the world in terms of theoretical Kabbalah. They conquer the world in terms of Kavanas. They conquer the world in terms of Nusach HaTefillah. And they conquer the world in terms of Minhag. Those two together more than almost anybody else. And then, of course, the Makabah Patish was through the Heilige Sfarim of Rabbi Lezer Papo, Rabbi Chaim Palaji, and Yosef Chaim. And of course, then you have the 20th century Paiskim and Mekubalim, Zechusam, talking to Leino, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu should keep them and keep them safe. And we all need Shmira. We definitely need the Shmira of the Heilige Tzaddikim.
I think we should talk quickly about the Eitz Chaim then of Al Shalom did.
Yeah, you should, but I want to jump in just to follow up on what Rav Shaul was saying. A couple things. First of all, you mentioned the Rashash as Rav Shalom Sharabi, not to be confused with the other Rashash in the Gemara. Make sure that everyone understands.
Correct. Yes, thank you for that. Correct.
Also, so we mentioned the Meir Poppers. I did a phenomenal episode with Avinoam Stillman on our Meir Poppers as well. Rabbi Yaakov Tzemach, to mention about him. I didn't do an episode. He's come up. He was also Morano, Converso, actually.
Yes, he was.
When he growing up, which was interesting. And
it's important to point out about the Yaakov Tzemach, just to add to what you're saying, that he, and in your podcast about Sefer Magid, Moshe Kramitz, he mentioned that he has a whole chibur about why is the Kabbalah of the Beis Yosef not like the Yad Magid, not like the Arizal. We're going to get into this much more explicitly, but the answer is it's just different. It's not a kasha. It's just different.
It's different. Okay, and his Sfarim Avat Shalom has been printing. And also, one more thing, the Nasi, the Rosh Nasi, Rosh Shapira, as you mentioned, to mention about him, that again is not the Megal Amukas. So it's a different Rosh Shapira. Also, we have a bunch of people with similar names, so I just want to clarify for the listeners like who it is we're talking about here. Okay, Rabbi, I'll let you talk about. You want to mention Eitz Chaim because now Avat Shalom. Yeah, that is. It's confusing enough as we're here. We're trying to clarify these Siddurim, as Rav Shaul just explained to us. Now we're going to say, what each kavan is and what's different, each nusach, what's going on. Mm-hmm. Then it's confusing enough. We get to Eitz Chaim itself. It's like one Eitz Chaim, different Eitz Chaim. Like, what's going on?
Exactly. Yeah. So, like the Mukubalim over the generations always talk about we're learning Eitz Chaim. The Shir and Eitz Chaim and Shar Kavanas, and they keep referencing back to pre Eitz Chaim, and they keep referencing back to Eitz Chaim. And everybody says, "Oh, great! I'm learning Rav Chaim Vital right now." If you open up the first printing of pre Eitz Chaim, that was in
1780.
1780. It says in there it's Mishpabeach, how important it is of Chaim Vital, how he's the how important it is. So look, it's on the first printing of there. That's why also on Hebrew books. But it's like Mishpabeach, how much of Chaim Vital is, and really it's Markowitz, how he was Orich. He took things, for example, just as an example, so it's in your hand. He'll take something from Shabbos, about a kavana by Baruch Hu by Shabbos, and open up on the chol. When you're having kavanas for Baruch Hu, you have this kavana of but this certain reish chav tooth yud k times yud k is reish chav hey. There's raka. He brings in that's talked about by Shabbos. Where in other places, Rav Chaim Vital he mentions that they are rach, but they're saying the Baruch Hu before and Baruch Hu after, but. We can talk about that also, but the point is that when you open up Eitz Chaim, what it's called now, actually it's called Eitz Chaim, which really feels Basa, the real Basa of Avat Shalom, you will see something completely different than what regular Eitz Chaim. Right? The quote regular Eitz Chaim from Meir Poppers has it under Kama, under Tinyana, under Basra. They have, and they're made up of different things. So you look on the Wikipedia page and get clear on what those things are, and Bez Hashem, you're because you have Professor Matt Goldish, right? So he'll talk about that much more. He'll talk about that much more explicitly. So you can pause here and listen to that one when it comes out. Listen to this in a couple of years. The point is that it's confusing what people are looking at. And in the Mikvalim today, all are giving you on learning on Eitz Chaim. That's what they're learning when you go to. But everybody knows about this chibur because it will only come out over the last 20 years. The person from Tefillas Chaim will talk about the Remembrance Federal Tefillas Chaim also, but he was learning off of these kisvei yad from Chaim Vital that were found only more recently. He was learning on them literally on a projector on his wall, 20 years ago in the early 2000s. Again, on a microfilm, it's projected on his wall, and they read them off of there. So today, Avat Shalom did us a huge favor, and they really went through and they put some the most recent edition, the Kutzer, has just some footnotes from Markowitz. An older version you'll see also from earlier that has much more, and the back has these layers and has the certain Rishonim, certain quotes with Ben Ish Chai, different places that are found. So when we're talking about Eitz Chaim, we're talking about the chibur from the chiburim that are from Avat Shalom. And we think that is primarily what, if you want to know what Rav Chaim Vital actually wrote, that's where you need to be looking.
Okay, so now let's get to the rpd.siddur and its connection into the Arizal. Let's kind of put it all together and get what is exactly going on. I'm sure many listeners are like, well, it's rpd.siddur, that's probably from rpd. We're here from this, and they're like, Dari, we got the whole history of Shaul, did a great job. Now, okay, so what's going on over here?
First of all, I think we have to understand that the very line in the Kisvei Rav Chaim Vital, based on how it was read or how it was printed, in some versions does not say Reish Pei Daled. In Pri Eitz Chaim, the original translation, it says Reish Pei Zayin. Now that's going to be very hard to find because there is no Siddur Venezia Svarad that was published in Reish Pei Zayin, not by Bomberg, not by any of the other Madpisim, Haloi Davarhu. But again, there's obviously things that are meant to be holding people back from being able to get at something which is maybe a little bit more mivurar about the Torah Sahari of Chaim Vital. And okay, so in Shar HaKavanos and in the Shar HaTefillah Ksavya Kotcher of Chaim Vital, we have explicitly that Chaim Vital has a section known as Drush Nusach HaTefillah. In this Drush Nusach HaTefillah, which is after he's already described and discussed the Kavanos and Hanhagas of the entire Seder of Shachris, Mincha, Arviz, he then has a drush in which he describes certain Shinuye Nusach And he, as he says, so that I should not have to be ma'irich too much. So therefore, the basic text I'm going to be using is the basic siddur I'm going to be using is the siddur gadol shakol hashana that is published b'shnas reish pei dalid liyitzira, again the year 1524. Now, again, I'm just going to repeat the very, very important element, and that is that first of all, it's not just an Arizal issue that Reish Pei Daled is something special. Every single person who does any type of research on the early influential Sidurim will see that Siddur Reish Pei Daled is uniquely influential, and the easiest way to tell is how many people tried to copy it and how long that particular, not only genre, but that particular arrangement and style of siddur became basically known almost generically as Sidure Venezia, because almost all the printers wanted to do what Daniel Bomberg, the Belgian Christian, and his loyal Jewish assistant, Cornelio Adelkind, what they did with Siddur Reish Pei Daled, what they already went through a Reish Ayin test, like we said, in 1519. But what they did in Reish Pei Daled was something super special. It became so much more easily readable. It became more legible. The font, everything was sharpened. It was just better. And then, as my colleague Michah was mentioning, and then not only did that become so popular and they sold out of that, but when they republished it 20 years later, when they republished it in 1544, they made sure on the frontispiece to say it's from Shnas Reish Pei Daled Liyitzira. In the back, you should know that, yes, not only is it like the Reish Pei Daled, at the back piece says Cornelio Adelkind in his endnote that you should know that if you look very carefully, especially just in the index, because he wrote an index, that I added many things onto the siddur that I didn't have in the previous siddur, and basically comes out and says, "You're welcome, Cornelio Adelkind, Shnas Daled Shin, year 1544." After that time, there's an explosion of what's called Sidure Venezia. Now, what's able to be viewed very easily, whether you have access to Eitzer Chachma or you have access to the National Library of Israel or other different wonderful sites. So there are a few different Sidurim which are very rare, but are more easily accessible to view on the internet. And Baruch Hashem, Michah was able to get the Reish Ayin test, which is not so easily able to get.
If anybody needs
However,
anything Siddur, we're happy to send links, and we're happy to send. Just please be in touch with us. We actually have, put our email rpd.siddur@gmail. We'll put everything in the show notes. You can email us. We'll give you links and tell you explicitly how to get all the stuff.
Yeah, we'll try to make sure that that's in the show notes and the link to the National Library of Israel one, the original Reish Pei Daled. But yeah, Rochelle, continue.
All right. So, what's important about the siddur Reish Ayin test and the siddur Reish Pei Daled, and then eventually all the different siddurim, which are basically coming to recapture Reish Pei Daled, or heaven forfend, but everyone's trying to improve upon the Reish Pei Daled, so not lose any of its great features, but also maybe add upon it or improve upon it in some way. And these siddurim pretty much had more or less the same nusach from Reish Ayin Tes through Shin Lamed Aleph through 1571. After that, the Sidurim changed, and they changed and one of the reasons why it changed is for a sefer. There was also a siddur called Sfarad Shin Chav Hey, which is very important, as well as one in Shin Chav Daled, but the Shin Chav Hey is much more important. There was a sefer that was published in Shin Chav Hey in 1565 by Rabbi Meir Ben Venisti from the famous Ben Venisti family. And Rabbi Meir Ben Venisti had a sefer, and the sefer is called Eis Emes, and the sefer Eis Emes is there to fix mistakes that are in classic editions of classic Sfarim. And he goes to town on the Agada, he goes to town on Mishnah, on Pesach, on Yalkut Shimaini. he goes to town. Now, he also says in his Akdama and mentions at the end, he has a kuntrus called Seder Kedusha, in which he's coming to be Magia from this extremely popular siddur that was published in Venezia in the year Daled Shin, and it has still so many mistakes. I'm going to correct those mistakes. And indeed, that sefer, which was published in Shin Chavei, interestingly enough, the next time it was published was in Shin Pei Daled, 100 years after Reish Pei Daled came out, and 80 years after Daled Shin, it was republished, interestingly enough. That's how popular it was as a resource. And again, those corrections started to take root in the Siddurim and Machzorim that were published in Shin Daled Mem in 1584, and then even more so in 1598, and then Unadei Weiter, as it gets further away, a few things are happening. Number one, the Sidurei Sfarad are slowly but surely becoming Shulchan Aruchized. They're coming Beis Yosefized because Beis Yosef conquered the world in a way, famously, what Maribe Rav didn't necessarily accomplish with his smicha and his hopes of making a Sanhedrin. Famously, the Beis Yosef created a new Mishnah and a new Sanhedrin called the Beis Yosef and the Shulchan Aruch. And on this self-same Sanhedrin and Beis Din, so we have the Ramah. And indeed, we find, like I said, that the Mekubalim are very interested in the minig and anhagas of Maran, as well as the other Gdolei Poskim, and very often very different than the Siddur Reish Pei Daled, and even very different than the express minig of the Ari and Reb Chaim Vital. So wrapping all that up, the main point that needs to be mentioned is as follows, is that it's not from nowhere that there's this minig and this nusach called minig Reish Pei Daled. Okay, it's popular, it's very, very influential. No, you have to understand something. The Siddur Reish Pei Daled, which is based on the Siddur Reish Ayin Tes, again, the 1524, which is based on the 1519. They are both based on the Sidurei Nusach Sfarad that were published 2 years before Gerus Sfarad, 2 years before the world of Sfarad went up in flames. In Reish Nun in 1490 in Naples in Italy, as well as in Reish Nun 1490 in Lisbon in Portugal. And guess what? We find that the minig that's in those Sidurim are almost exactly transplanted into those Sidurim. What makes that important? Because that tells you that the Sidurim, Reish Ayin Tes, Reish Pei Daled, Daled Shin, they represent a continuum from the late expression, the last gasp of Gerus, of the before the Sfarad type of literal Spanish Jewry, which actually had by that time a lot of influences that were part of Yadus Sfarad, and like if you want to look, for instance, at the Barbanel, the Barbanel says we go like all the Sfaradim, we paskin like the Rosh, says the Barbanel in his Haggadah. So obviously, we can't necessarily assume that everything is Rambam. We can't assume that everybody's going like the Beis Yosef. And once we realize that the minig Reish Pei Daled is its own continuum and its own system, so then we realize that actually we have our work cut out with making the siddur the best kind of Reish Pei Daled and Arizal merge that actually does justice to Reish Pei Daled as best as we can, as well as obviously we're doing whatever justice we can to the words of the Heilige Arizal and Reb Chaim Vital.
So let's clarify two things. You mentioned Reish Pei Daled, and this type of thing came up on the series I did with Michah Markowitz about early printed Hebrew books, which is, although the Tfus Rishon, and it's actually not the Tfus Rishon as you've said, really, the Reish Pei Daled, but we often, very often, and there's a reason why, but we import a certain kind of credibility. It's Tfus Rishon, that's like, the most important thing, but oftentimes it's not exactly 100% perfect. An example, you mentioned the Sefer MS. So how does that pertain to here when you're doing a new siddur, which we're going to get more into, but when you're trying to use Reish Pei Daled, as you said, we get to the best version, but then use the other versions and get to the best version of Reish Pei Daled.
So I'll throw it over here like this. If you open up Reish Pei Daled itself, there's steers, internal steers. There's a nikud. There is questions of what it means. Do you say this here or not? There's Baruch Hashem L'olam Amen V'Amen over there. Yeah, the famous in America they say it, and Brother doesn't say it, and the Chassidim don't say it, but some Chassidim do say it. It's there. It's in the siddur. Do you say it or do you not say it? Do you say Shir Shal Yom? Yes or no? There's a whole discussion. They talk about Magen Avraham and everything. We made our hachros ourselves. There's a bunch of there's things in there that the Arizal clearly was going off of and using in order to say no, don't do this. So you're right in the sense that Arizal. What's the point of Reish Pedal? He said the entire Shar Tefillah, he's going through and using Reish Pedal as a basis for what you're looking at. Now, it could have been something else. But the research that we've been doing is more and more is that he's really just he's relying on it. He's relying that's the siddur in front of you. So when somebody's trying to change it, you have to figure out why it's being changed. So for Reish Pei Dalet to go to Dalet Shin and add another Tefillas Amida by Michah that wasn't in the first edition, because it's just just say Karbonis Ashrei and then Omrim Amida, and then it has the Pitoch for it has the Nefillas Apayim and. Then do the next thing. Mincha is literally like 1.5 pages, right? So you see that in Dalet Shin, he was making it better by adding these things. That's one thing. There's another thing. It's like, where are they coming from? Are they coming from a world where the Nikud is perfect, or are they coming from a world where the Nikud is a different system? So as we go in through this, we saw there's a system in the Nikud that's being done. It was Shaul will talk about this. Hopefully, Ketzer, just not to be too geeky. We're very geeky in this siddur. If you really want to get us down to it, that there's Nikud that is very clearly Reish Pei Dalet Nikud. There's Nikud that is very clearly wrong. It can't be. And there's things like mole and chosfer. Like you'll spell Hashem Oz Lamo Yitain will be a mole, a vav, it's mole. And that's in the Tanakh, it's written like that. And then it says, As Amo Bashalom. Where's the base coming in over here? So there's things like, it's Vashalom. So I was writing with the base, not a vase. So we, to make Reish Pei Dalet better, we're trying to rely and make sure and see, contrast it to the previous and the ones afterwards, see why they changed and see, was that, what internally, were they just trying to fix something internally, or was it an external influence that said, no, the halacha is different? Different halacha.
Now let's talk about the Rav Chaim Vital, Arizal, and combined with Reish Pei Dalet before we get to your siddur, because Reish Pei Dalet, we'll put a link in the show notes and look it up. That's a siddur. It's a Nusach, as Shaul's explained, but it's a siddur. There's no kavanas. It doesn't have, when you think of the Hashem spread out, it's not that type of siddur. So it doesn't have Arizal stuff as it predates Arizal and Rav Chaim Vital and so on. So what kind of happens later to kind of put the kind of we already talked about the connection of what Ari says. I mean, Michah, you started off with that, but kind of, I guess, the connection between the two and how it becomes like kind of the later on Siddurim and what we have today. And if you can kind of like define more and explain more for the listener.
I think the best way to describe this is with some, let's give some actually interesting examples to prove that the Arizal act when Rav Chaim Vital writes Reish Pei Dalet, he actually was mechaven for Reish Pei Dalet and not something else. So I think Shaul will talk a little about the Nikud. And we find some interesting rayas from actually Chaim Vital himself. It's two places. I'll start with one, just the language of Chaim Vital himself. Is that he has a whole drush over here about al shinui called minig v'nuschos HaTefillah. It's on page Ayin Reish of the Tafshin Pei Gimel edition of Chaim Vital Eitz Chaim. He says over it's on Ayin Reish. He says. He changes. He says, this is now probably a lot of people that listen to this most people don't say this, but it is because it's the Akeda. We'll just kind of skip Karbonos. The Karbonos is actually quite essential in the systems. The first thing you're saying by Chachris is Elokeinu v'Akeda zochreinu b'zichron tov milofanecha ufakdeinu b'fkudas v'chulu dalis of ufkudas tia degusha v'lo rafuya. It should be degusha and not rafui. So when we looked at this at the beginning, you think, it's fixing one error, and you can theoretically be like, okay, here you change it, don't change it anywhere else. If you look closer, it's realizing this is just like a simon. It's like a sign to tell people there's something going on over here. The Dalet of Kudas spelled in Aiden Sharp Philo over here, page Ayin Aleph, is spelled Mole. That's not how you spell Ufkudas. You spell Chaser. And then he changes, because there's no Nikud in this, right? And then the Dalid is not without a dogish. So it should be Ufkudas, and not Ufkudas, the Dalid, right? So the Beged Keves he cared about. So as we started working on this, there's a lot of Reish Pei Daled issues. There's because of this new defus and this new printing. It wasn't like they were trying to ignore it. It's just that they probably just didn't have the technology to get it done everywhere. So, and also one other thing, I think they were coming off of the old Siddurim without Nikud. There's no Nikud in older Siddurim, or very minimal. The Vav is very important. You don't want to say Ufgadas, Ufgudas. You want to say it much more clearer, so it's clearly indicated to you what to say if there's no Nikud. So they're coming off of there, even though they were had very good Nikud, and you can look at the HTML, the Nikud is very clear. I actually held the copy, and last time of Israel, I went and held it. So there's some pictures of that also, and it's very clear, very, very clear. And so we use that as a kind of springboard to realize that you have to deal. This was something he cared about.
I'm not sure where to go from there, but in terms of our siddur, I'll tell you where I think we need to go just to appreciate what the siddur is. So there's a number of layers to making this siddur something which is both halacha l'maisa and something which is usable. And that is that every single element that has to do with Nusach HaTefillah, and more than just Nusach HaTefillah, as in what text do you say or not say, or what order do you say what text, but also all the different body positions that we take for granted. Is it something that needs to be done seated, dafka standing? Does it make a difference? Are you supposed to have your feet together? Does it make a difference if your feet together or not? Should you be even audible at all during tefillah? Forget about even tefillah b'lachash. Other different hanhagas in a Beis HaKnesses and a Beis HaMedrash, and one could take the hanhagas of the Ari, and not only one can, we find almost everywhere that they possibly can, Paiskim from all different parts of all different elements of Yiddishkeit, almost all of them care about what the Arizal had to say, and almost all of them care about what that means in terms of halacha l'maisa. And therefore we said, all right, there are Sidurei Arizal out there. We are familiar. The problem is most of what the Sidurei Arizal are doing is mainly presenting kavanas in a way which is halacha l'maisa for a mechaveh. But what we wanted to make was a siddur that was first and foremost for the mispalel. Now, should this mispalel happen to have some familiarity and want to have a kavanas light version to the siddur, Michah can tell you about the kavanas which he chose for that version. But we also wanted to make sure that there's a non-kavanas version as well. And not only a non-kavanas version, but a non-kavanas version for Chol, and then a non-kavanas version for Shabbos and for Moyadim, so that people could actually be nene from the Eitz HaChaim, and they can mamish see that Eitz Hadas is Tov, and that Be'ez Hashem, hopefully, with Siyata D'Shmaya in parsing the words and hanhagas of the Arizal and Rechaim Vital, as understood through, as we mentioned before, this canon and matrix of Mekavolim, as well as many, 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 many other sources, but those are just very, very important. And also with mentioning that it's always important to mention that the siddur helps a person focus that whenever you're learning the Arizal and something which has to do with anything having to do with halacha or minhag, you have to know what we're starting with. And once you understand that you have a siddur reish pei daled, you know what you're starting with. And when I say you know what you're starting with, it's like, okay, fine. So what are we?
Can I pause over here? So I think you're meandering a little bit on this section.
Sure.
You want to talk
Go right
about
ahead.
You're talking
Sure. Go
general
right
and
ahead.
you have to share and things like that. To go back to where I finished, which is the Nikud, you're going right.
You
I think
take
you
it,
should
take,
go.
take it,
No,
take it
no, I
away.
don't want you
You
to.
got it.
No, I want you to take it. I want you to take it. Okay, fine. Talk about specifically about what race pay dollars, other things race pay dollars, because race pay dollars and how we fix them.
So in order to understand the Sidurim of Reish Ayin Tes, Reish Pei Dalet, and Dalet Shin, again, the Sidurim of 1519, 1524, and 1544, we have to remember who this Siddur was written by and who this Siddur was written for. Now, who do I mean by who is this Siddur written by? So you have to understand that when Bomberg came to Venice from Belgium, he didn't just set up a printing press and hire just people and dudes who wanted to apprentice. He actively hired Talmidei Chachamim from the region to be involved in editing and helping make sure, because guess what? If somebody sends him a lemon of a text and he spends a lot of money, right, putting that out there, people told him, like, what? Like, somebody messed with you. That's not what people do, right? That would be a major, major hefsid. So just the opposite. He did a lot of field research to know what is he capable of doing? He wants to know what is the minhag of Sfardim in Italy. So Sfaradim, who are Yotzei Sfarad, who live in Italy, circa 1519, 1524, what were they doing? How did they pronounce things? And one way that that's expressed is, interestingly enough, in the Haggadah. Because in the Haggadah, like many Haggadahs, has the traditional vernacular, the Judeo fill in the blank. So, and by us, it's actually Ladino. But if you look at how the Ladino is menukad, you realize that the Ladino is menukad by an Italian person speaking Spanish with an Italian accent. So you realize that their mom is dealing with the Sfaradim who lived in the region of Venice, who is an Ir Ve'em V'Yisrael, a place of great scholarship. And Mamela, therefore, there's a lot of Kayach and Mayach that were invested into the Siddur Reish Pei Dalet. Now, obviously, there's a lot of other Siddurim and other different Chiburim that are related to this, but I'm going to send it back to Michah to take it home.
Right. And the next thing really here to talk about, I think, is really to see that a lot of the classic Hebrew language, those Kodesh conjugations and vowel systems, are strange. If you look at a regular siddur, it's Yachedcha, or Veshimcha, or Harachamon. Harachamon, the Patach, Adufa, under there. We saw, when you go through Reish Pei Dalet Siddur, you see that these systems here are based on, without getting too geeky, as Shaul really could do, that they're based on different types of Aramaic systems. And which Aramaic system when, without going into details, you see that it's Harachman most of the time. It's Leyachdoch. I today from Reish Pei Dalet to Dalet Shin, they even fixed one of those. It said Leyachadoch, and it fixed it. And even later, even when you get into the Siddurim of the Mechidah, you'll see these things maintaining themselves. It's alam la'almei almaya with a patach and not a komats. So I asked, we first started this, it's like, you look in the Reish Pei Hey Tanakh, and the Targum is with the patach also. Like, are they both wrong? And the answer is no. It was a whole system of nikud that was developed, that was utilized in different parts of the siddur. For different parts of Aramis and different parts. So you'll have Yachadim, not Miyachadim, Miyachadim, which would be more Hebrew grammar, whereas the nun at the end, and Mishnayos knows that a nun at the end is masculine. And you'll have, right? There's a lot of other examples, right? The Yachdoch is that's something Shaul will go more deep into without being too complicated, but suffice to say, we see these patterns over and over and over again in Kaddish and in different things which Aramis are you doing, which Nikud are you doing, and there are systems. And we saw an interesting riot from the Arizal himself. He's saying he had a piyut that was meant to be sung at the end of every Suda. And if you count we count the syllables at each stanza, you'll see that they match much more with a certain type of aramis than a different one. So our siddur, we presented that type of nikud without going too far away from it, because we found that the lashon you don't. I'll ask you, Navi, what language do you daven in?
Hebrew.
Right. Hamachazir Shechina Solitzion. The word machazir, what is the chazir in Lashon Kodesh? Right? This is really, as we figured out, is a Hebrew-sized version of the word hadar. So you're not really speaking Lashon Kodesh per se. You're speaking a systemic, Lashon, we call it Lashon Chachamim. So you'll have things like, for example, the Begi Kevis at the beginning of a word will be Tegusha. Really? Yeah. Bashalom. But however, we can't go with that pasuk because the Arizal is not going to say it like it was written in with trop and like it was written in there. So certain things we moved over to keep the nikud from Tanakh, to move the nikud of Tanakh. But other things we tried to leave it there because it was a system. It was valid. It was used. It was used also in the Ashkenazi Siddur. It was used in the Sova Siddur at the same time. So we really saw systems and tried to keep them as much as we could.
So let's talk. I mean, you've talked already a bunch about your Siddur rpd.siddur, which we have in Chayil and Shabbos, but let's talk more specifically. The listener can understand what exactly it is that a listener would be getting if someone purchases this Siddur, someone reads this Siddur, wants to daven from this Siddur. What exactly are they getting? And also, it goes in hand, it's really the same questions. How does that differ from other? There are many Siddur Ari, Siddur Minhageri, right? People can go to the store like, well, here's all different types. What is going on? How do I know what I'm looking at?
What we're doing is absolutely, it definitely means learning the Kisvei Ari that are relevant, and even those that are not relevant and well, and seeing as much as we can of the various, commentary and secondary and tertiary and auxiliary literature on the subjects. And what we did was we realized that we can't just take the raw 1524 text and then the raw Ksavia Kotre or Vital and just say, okay, we're just going to keep Reish Pei Dalet as is. We're going to keep the 1524 Siddur as is, just adding on it only what's absolutely necessary according to Rabbi Vital and the Arizal, or maybe anything that's even indicated by Rabbi Vital and the Arizal. Otherwise, you keep the Reish Pei Dalet exactly as is, as if it's like completely unmoved. And it does not make sense to us. And nor does it make sense to a lot of other people to just have the Reish Pei Dalet Siddur be left without some type of serious editing of the Nikud, and that includes what you do with Beged Kefes. So that being said, so therefore we felt it's a covet for the Siddur and a covet for the Arizal that on one hand we don't just leave the Siddur Reish Pei Dalet as is. On the other hand, we have to really learn Reish Pei Dalet to know what exactly Reish Pei Dalet is trying to be. What Reish Pei Dalet, if it had, let's say, if it had an endless amount of money on budget for editing and for Nikud, what would it look like?
And the computer with InDesign.
Right, exactly. Right. Can you just continue, Michah?
Sorry,
you continue. It's good.
I was zeichet to kind of fall into this by accident. This whole thing, I ended up taking on the whole job of doing all the work, making sure that the Nikud was actually put in place. I'm taking cues also from the Tfilas Chaim Center. Now, it's very important to mention, very, very, very important. 20 years ago, it was published by Daniel Rimmer. Interesting. Just sidebar. Daniel Bomberg was the other editor there. So the Daniel Rimmer came and he re-energized the Reish Pei Dalet world, and I'm Michah Daniel. That was an interesting sidebar. But the point was that when you take this and you put it in Reish Pei Dalet, it had comments caught them. I don't know if many of the listeners, the Sephardi listeners, will appreciate this. There's an all sound, like a more. They call it Zol Charenu. It was indicated in the rpd and siddur, not necessarily in the way that we are normally indicating it. So we had to kind of indicate it in our way, with with the chetufas, but not without. How we did it. When you look in the siddur, we'll send a sampling out also, so people can take a look at it. But to have shvanah and shvanach, to have these more indication of how to pronounce it better, to where to put a metag, to say, it has to be meleh or melera, or a little bit of both. We did the best job we could to really give the ability for the mishalal to enjoy. Something else very important about HaTefillah, what he did was he really made a masterpiece. He has the Sefer and the Siddur. The Sefer was really going through a lot of the stuff we did without, which we talked at a 30,000 foot view. He did it at a very, very deep view. We have certain things that we disagree with him on the sense that he certainly stopped in a certain sense of rpd. Okay, for example, Al Michah in our Siddur is different from Al Geffen. In rpd, they're different. So they're slightly different. There's two is a Sada, and there's an extra Shem Elokeinu. But we keep seeing it over and over again. Shin Tess and just Brachas that was published over there, then it probably was likely part of the halacha. We're not meshubed to Shulchan Aruch in that sense. It was not meshubed to Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch came out in Shin Chav Hey. And, it was Shin Yud Gimel, and Beis Yosef was published. So we're dealing with a system that was not in that world. And we're trying to put into this Torahs to be able to take the halachas and take them farther. Take them, go with them, and ride with them, see how far they go. Are they Yineged halacha? No, he sees it going in like that. Shaul did a ton of research into the Goinim and in the Rishonim to verify every single thing. Challah, it's mentioned in Reish Pei Daled that there's two brachas, one for the first challah and one for the second challah, which a lot of the Rishonim say don't do. The Markowitz says second bracha is the bracha of V'tala. And then the Chaim Vital, and we have to contrast that with Chaim Vital, who just says you burn the challah. So to come up and synthesize under that.
I just want to jump in. So this, like I said, you printed Chayil, you printed Shabbos, and we can tell listeners how they can get a hold of those Siddurim. But you can tell listeners what else you're doing. But a lot of the research, we've discussed a lot of the history, the research, fascinating stuff here on this episode, that you didn't publish.
Right. And
why not?
Yeah, that's the sham. The good news is that if somebody can get a hold of Tefillas Chaim, Sefer Tefillas Chaim, which they're floating around, people can get access to it. It has there's a lot of that research. A lot of it. There's also on Hebrew books. Zaytun wrote, has a Reish Pei Daled Siddur Ish. He has a lot of notes also from these same places as well. Also, Rav Yaakov Hillel Shlipa, he in V'yoshav Vayam Chelik Hey, which recently came out, I guess in March 2025, something like that. Most recently, so maybe more in 2026 he came out. So it has a lot of the same ha'aras, does a lot of research, has on Mishumodim. Now, Rav Yaakov Hillel goes a little differently. He goes, from what I'm seeing, with the thing that really Reish Pei Daled is very, very important. But if the Rashash says differently, we're going to go with Rashash. And I was speaking to Gedolim that all have said similar things to me. If Rashash said it, we have to go with Rashash. So what we did was we did not mishabed ourselves with Rashash. We felt that there was just Rav Chaim Vital by himself was enough of an information warehouse just to gain from him. There's a postscript also that discuss, can you do the Rav Chaim Vital with the Rashash? That's how far it goes. And yes, they say, yeah, you're allowed to do that. You're allowed to do that. We can give you the Markowitz and brought in Torahs Chacham, and where is it also the Shaul? That line? Right. So from the grandfather. Yes, from Rav Shrem, who was the grandfather of one of the people that we're zechet to get have a close relationship with and get really start from there because he gives also a scholar to our siddur. He wrote a called Kitzer Ikari Kavanas from Chaim Ariv Rashash. So from an idea of Kitzer Kavanas, we kind of built a siddur around it. Now we're not saying that people talk about, you're doing Kavanas or Rashash. No, we're trying to do Kavanas of Chaim Vital. And beyond that, we have a siddur that I think is a children called Nefesh. Anyway, doesn't want to do Kavanas, there's no Kavanas, but realize they want to daven. The Arizal gave a Hefcher sample to this siddur. We have a non-Kavanas full version is available, or will be available for pre-order depending on when you listen to this. Exactly.
So it's good. You just answered the question of, what if someone doesn't you say kavanas and do that. So you're saying they'll have this text of siddur, which again is Nusach Sfard, but they'll have this text. Now, yes, Sfard means Sfardi, but when you mentioned availability, so you had Shabbos, you have Chol. How are these things available? What are you working on now?
Okay, so first like this. So Shabbos is a project we're not going to be ready yet. I don't think it's ready for Rosh Hashanah. It's just there's a lot more going on because you realize that the assumption of all the Mekubalim has always been everything is everywhere all the time, and we've kind of opened up a whole new everything's and all at once. It's everything's Seidim and everything is true always. I learned from, like I say, Shaul has been more a madrich and a Rabbi of mine in a lot of ways. I've learned that we're trying to stick to the concept of kol mosif, harizal megareya, and the other mahalach is really kol marva harizal meshubach. So we're trying to stick to, in the Gemara's version at least, it's a little more complicated because we had to pick which ones. And that was more of had to become justified and understandable and give you a feel that you're doing something in davening. Not just that you're davening and you're saying words and Hashem wants you to say words. No, you're telling to the Ratzon Habayri how He wants you to build up the world from Asiya to Tira to Bria to Tzilas, and the Kesser of Asiya is to really get as high as you can through the Tefillah. And just as an aside for Kavanas, people can have Kavanas. It's a trainable thing. It's a learnable thing. It is not impossible. And it's really for anybody it's for anybody if they really put their heart's desire to it. Most people, at least in my head, I can think about 3 things at once, or 2 things at once at least. Yeah, I can do this, but I can work a little bit, and I can also do work on the siddur while I'm listening to somebody. So while I'm davening, I'm thinking about other things half the time. So this really, I think Kavanah is there. I think seeing a shame, seeing a gematria, seeing knowing what you're doing, what you're building right now, what yichud is happening right now, just helps the tefillah go higher. And at this point, I can't help but describe how during the war that said probably will never end until Mashiach comes. I was very affected. When I went to America, I was really talking to Shaul about it. About what can I do? I'm learning this stuff from the Arizal, and I what do I do with Ashkenaz? How does it fit? And we said rpd, and we got into this. I was thinking about why? We need to really fill ourselves with Torah and Tefillah. And the Ron always say Mechazik and Torah and Tefillah. So what does it even mean? So from my angle, I thought the following, and if you don't mind, I'll talk about the thing. Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva has 3 stories. There's 3 stories of Rabbi Akiva. They're all very important. Number 1, the story of him in the cellar. Everybody knows. I'll change my life because I see a truth. There's another story that he, 24,000 Talmidim died. He started over. Completely different Torahs that he had before. There's a 3rd actually at my vort, he mentioned the following. He said that, he pointed out that Shimon and Sunni, the Kiva Darshan Kol Esmei Sheva Torah, and then he stopped and he came to ask the Shem L'Kesha Tira. Shimon ben Sunni said, ask the Rav to Nusach. So he said, no, Rabbi Akiva is still in the Kabul. He said, no, I don't go that way. He undid every single drasha he ever said in his life. They're all based on everything all together and totally started the Torah again because he had a kasha. We had a good kasha. So I'm thinking to myself, at any given time, I'm always thinking to myself, where is my Rabbi Akiva moment? I've had many of them in my lives, but this was one of them. That I'm davening just Ashkenaz. I'm learning. I stand with my tefillin on. I'm learning everything Ashkenaz for years. I'm an Ashkenazi Jew. And in fact, I'm also an anticle of the Baal Shem Tov. How can I go away from anything that's Ashkenazi? And I realized that, no, this is where all the Gedolim of all the generations have always been trying to focus our attention, get access to the Arizal. So we wanted to make that Arizal accessible. And I'll mention also, lastly, with a friend of mine who was killed on October 7th on Solastera, Yosef Gedalia, who was also their family is actually from Portugal originally. They live in Beit Shemesh today. I was close friends with him actually through the same Yerusha of the Erev Shabbos Vad on Shmiras Guf that we mentioned earlier. that I got to know him there, and he was in the Devon, and he was killed in action. I felt like I'm learning in Go. I'm working out. I'm not in the army. How do you make your davening better? And this is what I found. I'm not saying everybody has to do it. I think it's very important that everybody should find exactly where it's going to be for them. In order to make oneself a better davener, they have to really connect it to feeling in the right way. And this is the way that I connected to it. So how can you get the siddur? Good question. We're still working exactly out. There are distributors. We'll have to put them in the show notes. Mr. Shannon will have at least pre-orders. You can always contact us at rpd.siddur@gmail.com. We'll be able to answer that and give you direction. We also have on Amazon presently, we have both a slichot for Elul, which we appropriately called Ani Dodi Li, because everything else is off. All the siddur, we tried to milk the sharing reference as much as we could. We also have a Mincha Mariv over there that is available that you can get as well. It's just a paperback. We'll put it on a little cheaper for the on sale a little bit, and you'll be able to give links over there. But the actual hardback cover, they're actually while we're recording, they're being dealt with the final editing, final putting it together right now. Getting to the States will probably take the end of August, and we'll give more details when the podcast comes out, and we'll send some more stuff out on the WhatsApp channel.
Okay, so I will I'll put your email address in the show notes. I'll put links to that, what you just mentioned, in the show notes. And hopefully everyone found this informative and interesting. When I did, I know that I learned a lot. This was not something that I knew super much about. And also, as we started off with, it's the Arizal's yard site. So this is appropriate to talk about this at this time. And to, thank you both. Thank you, Michah. Thank you, Shaul, for joining me to discuss the Siddur Ari, Siddur rpd, rpd.siddur, all of it.
We'll be, if there's more questions and more, there's a lot more.
Always more to talk about. We can go for another. We can make a mini series that go hours and hours. You ready? Yeah, we can go. There's much more to talk about.
And why is it important this siddur over another one? It gets very, very involved, and this we should have provided at the beginning a big trigger warning, but we didn't get to the big trigger stuff about how we're different than this Chassidus and different than this Rashash. But we'll talk to privately. Anyone wants to give us an email.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you so very much. Such a pleasure to first of all to talk to somebody who actually listens so well and so interested and so curious, and makes us feel very, very welcomed and valued. I also want to thank again my shutov, my very good friend Michah, without whom this would not be possible at all, and it would not be able to be a siddur that could be enjoyed and actually used. So whatever research and whatever other different kinds of responsibilities each one of us had, the fact that it's a real siddur that people can actually pre-order and receive and pay, and Riz Hashem, you're going to have Hagayas and you're going to complain about it, and we're going to have to incorporate it or further research into the Matzvah, Tinyana, and Bezer Hashem, HaKadosh Baruch Hu Shebenshos, all with the Heilige Bracha of L'chsheyafutza Ma'inasach Chutza, which is Takasi Geulas HaPrat V'Geulas HaKlal. Amen v'amen. Can you hear us? In the schools of the Heilige Arizal, the Rechaim Vital, schools I'm talking Elena Makol Yisrael. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.